cyberspace and their cyber growth and technology. Part of the focus is on e-government and e-commerce, but there's also an element of social progress in there as well. So it's mostly governance and economic issues, but knowing full well that this, of course, is going to change the everyday lives of millions of people in China. So some of the key elements of this strategy are to provide nationwide cyber infrastructure. That's a goal most countries have, but that's a particularly challenging goal in a country the size of China. To strengthen capabilities for independent innovation of cyber technologies. That sounds really good. That sounds very interesting. What that might be alluding to is to have cyber technologies for China to be not dependent on the technologies that are in place that are owned and operated by companies in the U.S. or in Japan. The infrastructure of cyberspace is not owned and operated by China. And so this may be a reflection of China's intent to no longer become dependent on other countries for use of cyber infrastructure. Some of their other goals are to optimize the cyber industry structure, improve cybersecurity, of course, making their economy more cyber-oriented, and then, interestingly enough, the last point, enhance capabilities to apply cyber technologies among the people. And that could be interpreted a lot of different ways. That could be just having people have better access for social purposes, for business purposes, for governmental purposes. But it could also be alluding to sort of a rise of techno-nationalism, where you can have non-state actors, where you can have patriotic hackers who hack at the request of the government to help further nationalist goals as well. So it's sort of interesting that that could go either way. The emphasis from China's strategy is on information warfare. So not just technological innovation, but actually developing an information warfare strategy for the 21st century. Becoming less dependent on other countries, as I mentioned. A lot of the emphasis is also on reconnaissance of foreign websites, as much as it is attacking. There's the espionage, but there's also the reconnaissance that takes place to probe systems, to find out where their weaknesses are, so that those systems are known in advance of a potential future conflict. And then lastly, the one thing that we hear a lot about with China and cyberspace is cyber espionage and information theft. And currently this information theft is the largest theft in human history, and China's behind most of it. So that's a very important point. In fact, we're going to talk for a few minutes on that in just a moment. So who's involved in cyberspace in China? Just like in the US, we have a myriad of agencies that all have different roles and different responsibilities. There are also different players in China. One, there's a Ministry of Public Security that focuses on cybercrime and critical infrastructure protection. There's a State Encryption Bureau for party, military, and civilian encryption. The State Secrets Bureau for all the classified networks. Ministry of Industry, Information Technology for the telecom industry. But the big actor is the PLA, of course. And there are a couple different parts of the PLA, and in fact, some of my colleagues know the PLA here better than I do. But there's a unit in Beijing that has some subunits that are involved in signals intelligence and code breaking. This is probably their closest equivalent to the US Cyber Command. But then there's the other unit, which is also called the Shanghai Group, which is tasked with, I should say fostering political, military, and economic intelligence, gathering intelligence on the US through cyber means. So these are units that are devoted specifically towards gathering intelligence on the US, whether it's political, economic, or military. And they're estimated up to about 40 other units like this. And this unit was the one that became very well known last February, about 14 months ago, with the Mandiant report about the Chinese hacking on the US and US industry and US government. And this was the group that was behind it. But they're not the only group that does it, but this is what they are specifically tasked with. So the PLA is a major player in cyberspace. Sun Tzu offers us a little bit of insight into how we can think about cyber warfare and how Chinese cyber strategy might be developed in the future. famous quote from Sun Tzu, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." And the art of war specifically advocates the use of spies for every kind of business. So the idea that espionage should be taking place in cyberspace should really be nothing new, should not be surprising to people familiar with Chinese military strategy or philosophy. This is just an extension of ideas that have been around for thousands of years. So there's very strong basis within China for espionage and for being a part of information warfare strategy. So the espionage that I'm referring to is the massive theft of intellectual property. Every sector of the U.S. economy has been targeted: finance industry, oil industry, defense, government, even small furniture makers in Massachusetts have been targeted for Chinese espionage. Not sure what they're getting from those furniture makers, but apparently it was worth the time. The most famous example is F-35 fighter jet, of course. The U.S. has spent over $250 million developing it. It was supposed to give the U.S. technological advantage for the next 20 or so years. And it's been hacked into at least 3 times by China, once mid-air during a test flight, and now design elements from this are popping up in Chinese tests. They're Chinese military tests. So this is a famous case, but a classic case of how damaging this can be, because not only are the $250 million that the U.S. has invested in this, that intellectual property is being taken, and there's also that military advantage that's being diminished in real time. So in general, the effects of cyber espionage, billions of dollars, virtually every company, every industry. 97% of Fortune 500 companies admit to being hacked. The other 3% have been hacked, they just won't admit to it. And it's not just economic espionage or military espionage, it's also diplomatic espionage, stealing plans for negotiations, things like that. So it runs the gamut, all types of information. And so who commits it? Well, everyone, all states in particular. I mean, we shouldn't assume that the U.S. isn't doing this. But certainly, we know that China is doing it. It's the most frequently accused of cyber espionage, especially of intellectual property theft. And this is because on the Chinese side, China's economy has grown very much in recent decades by producing goods that were developed in other countries. But to sustain the growth, China needs to be able to innovate and do this development on its own, if it's possible. It's not clear if it can. However, if they have the intellectual property, then they can go ahead and build from there with the innovation. So that allows the attackers to skip the costly and time-consuming process of research and development. And I should mention that China, of course, vehemently denies being involved in economic espionage or intellectual property theft. However, the statistic of their 96% of recorded state-affiliated attacks targeting business trade secrets could be traced back to China in 2012. So the government of China denies it, but there seems to be a lot of evidence suggesting that China's behind it. And some of the problems with espionage: not everybody's playing by the same set of rules. Free market is not working the way it should when one group can do the research and development and then another group profit from it. This will ultimately threaten the long-term economic security and thus national security of the country that is doing the research and development. And this is essentially an unprecedented transfer of wealth in the form of business plans, product designs, and it can ultimately make a country uncompetitive if they can't benefit from their innovation. So for the U.S. and China, some challenges in cyberspace. Cyberspace and cybersecurity is one of the major issues for U.S.-China relations, of course. Some of the challenges with cyberspace, but also particularly with this relationship, are problems of attribution, where it's really hard to say definitively and with evidence where an attack is coming from. And even if you can pinpoint the physical location, you have to be able to identify the actual computer, and then the person at the computer, and then the authority under which they're acting. So attribution is very, very difficult in cyberspace in general, and China is no exception to that. In cyberspace, offense has the advantage, where you just need to succeed once, and defense has to be successful 100% of the time. there's the gap between the time in which cyber attacks happen so quickly, and then the great lag for policy development. Policy takes a lot longer to happen. Cyber attacks are instantaneous, and so there's a disconnect there, just by nature of the way those two things work. And then the decentralization and the rise of non-state actors. And this could be the patriotic hacker groups I mentioned. This could be maybe state-supported but unaffiliated groups. This type of techno-nationalism coming from within China for domestic reasons and encouraged by the government. But this poses another challenge because the attacks may not be coming from the Chinese government themselves. And there's a fundamental disconnect between the US and China on their views of cyberspace. The US advocates for cyberspace that's open, interoperable, secure, and reliable. Free expression, security, international commerce. Those are the things that the US pursues and supports in cyberspace. From the Chinese perspective, global commerce and security are ideas that they promote, but they are defined a little bit differently, and there's a bit of more emphasis on the potential for internal threats and instability within China as a result of technology and interconnectedness. So potential solutions, I don't have many. I have one, and it's, if I had the answer, then it's mutual understanding and greater trust. Somehow we need to get there. We could also be working on those challenges about attribution and offense dominance. Those things are always helpful to work on at the same time. But in terms of the relationship, last year a cyber working group was formed, US and China, to help work on these types of cybersecurity issues. But basically, the countries are pretty far apart at this time, and it will take time and a lot of effort to come together and build a greater trust. And so that's the direction we're going, but I don't have any silver bullet solutions at this point in time. So I thank you for your time, and I will take any questions now if you have any.
So thanks for coming back, Professor Russell. Really nice to see you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm very curious about the case with the F-35 and stealing secrets about the design of the plane. And I can imagine that that's really a sophisticated hack, because not only do you need to somehow get that information, but you need to know what it means. You need, mechanical engineers to understand it. So I guess I'm just curious more about the logistics, if there's any information on how, the Chinese hackers were able to kind of acquire that information and the logistics behind those types of hacks.
That's a great question. I'm not exactly sure how technically the attack took place. I'm sure they somehow gained access to the development plans, and then probably left a back door so that they could go back at other points in time and revisit the sites and take more information as it was being developed. It is a very sophisticated attack to be able to happen on a piece of equipment as sensitive as that, and multiple times. But there have been other types of attacks that have, I believe, have come from China that have lasted for 3-5 years, that have just been sucking information from governments, from businesses for a long period of time, and many of them have been traced right back to China. So while it is a sophisticated type of attack, it's not a type of attack that is. There are other types of attack that are also similar that have been done. This one it just happens to be a big impact one. But this whole idea of being able to access and re-access information from the same company over time without being detected is something that we've seen China do on several occasions.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm not sure about exactly how the technical works.
Thanks.
Well, that's really loud. I'll just kind of project from here. I'm Ivan Rasmussen, a PhD candidate in Fletcher, and a friend of Alice also. So, 2 questions. The first one's kind of informational. Can you talk a little bit about the hardware behind this kind of the cyber realm, right? We're talking like undersea cables and things like that. And then the second question, I think, is getting to your solutions. It seemed as though your solution is a government-initiated one, and yet a lot of the issues seem to be at least the way you were framing it, a China to U.S. private sector situation, right? So is there maybe some area where private sector can play some sort of role? What kind of role might that be? Just kind of thinking off the top of my head, because it seems as though, I mean, of course, from your example, the U.S. Defense is being attacked and it's threatened by this, as I assume also is true for China. But the one who's getting hit the most, the one area that's really getting hit the most is defense.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. To answer the second one first, yeah, I probably should have made a bigger point, but that was sort of the diplomatic solution that I was thinking of if we're assuming China as a government, as a nation, is behind these attacks, and the U.S. as a nation is trying to respond. But if you break it down to the private industry, I mean, I think something that should be done regardless of the diplomatic efforts are increased security measures. And I think that there's a great need for public-private partnership within the U.S. in order to foster information exchange, to give incentives to the private sector to share information with each other, even if it's anonymously, and with the government, and so that everybody can collectively improve their own cybersecurity. So the government may be able to share some information with the private sector as well about what they know. So I think that is the first step, is improving cybersecurity within the U.S., working on the attribution problem, working on those other challenges I listed, but definitely promoting the exchange of cybersecurity-related information within the U.S. among private industry, because with 97% of Fortune 500 companies being hacked, they know a lot and they have a lot of information, but companies have a disincentive to talk about it because they have stakeholder interests, they have competitive interests, they have regulation type interests, they have liabilities, and so they're very, very reluctant to come forward unless they absolutely have to say, well, this is what happened to us. But if companies were able to share that in a way that mitigated the risk for them, other companies might also be able to learn from it, and then collectively there would be greater cybersecurity as a result of something like that. So that should be done first, actually, before we even get to the diplomatic, because the diplomatic solution will likely take a long, long time, whereas there are short-term measures that can and should be taken. And with regards to your first question on physical infrastructure, so there are several layers within cyberspace. The first layer, the sort of basic layer, is the physical layer, and that is comprised of the fiber optic cables that run under seas, satellites up in space, the hardware. It also involves computers to a certain extent, the hardware of cyberspace. And we often think of cyberspace as being this wireless digital network, but there's very real tangible infrastructure that's behind it. And that infrastructure, it has to be maintained, and it's mostly owned by private companies. In fact, in the U.S., between 80 and 90% of the cyber infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. So the government's role for cybersecurity is complicated in that it doesn't own the infrastructure through which cyber attacks come. So that's the physical layer, the most basic layer, foundational layer. Beyond that, there's a logical layer, and that is how the information is passed, the data packages, how they're routed through cyberspace to get from my email to your email, or when I want to go to CNN.com, I get CNN.com. It's that trafficking of information, that logic pattern that's there. And then beyond that, we get more to the systems level with different computers and networks, and then the users, essentially. That's the people. And in many ways, sometimes the people are the most challenging part of cyberspace because there are so many people, and we're all rather unpredictable, and even when we have the best of intentions, we can accidentally download malware. We don't know it's there, it's hidden, it's designed to be hidden, so you may not know you're downloading it, but you do. And then there's people who don't know they're downloading it, and, or people who are clicking on things from Nigerian princes and downloading stuff. So the users are a particularly challenging part because there are so many variables associated with us. So those are the layers of cyberspace, and the one that China has talked to, that I was referencing with regards to increasing control over is that physical layer. There are 13 root servers around the world for all of cyberspace, and 10 of them are located in the U.S. The other 3 are in U.S. allied countries. None are in China. So that's another example of China would probably really like to have control over at least one of those. Without those 13, cyberspace doesn't operate.
So I have a question. I guess I'll speak to my. So thanks for coming. But so my question is about the Great Wall of China. So they have this term, the Great Firewall of China, and I think Dr. Austin spoke a little bit about this yesterday. But what do you think are some of the domestic concerns of the Chinese government? Because it is hard to micromanage 591 million people using the internet nowadays.
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that really goes to the domestic politics issue of China, which I think the people in the audience and in the panel probably know a little bit better. But I think it goes to an emphasis. It links back to the term informationization, the fact that for China, cyberspace is all about the transfer of information, and that can be destabilizing for the government if people gain access to information, approach problems differently, have different types of solutions. It can change society. It does change society. And so I think the Great Firewall of China is an attempt to exert domestic control over that flow of information so that the government can better control its own population, its own society. They're not the only ones. They just happen to be very, very well known for their firewall. But Russia, for example, has a blacklist of, I think, 80,000 websites that you can't go to, and that number increases daily. So it's, I think it's a reflection of the Chinese government's insecurity, the fact that they feel the need to have a firewall to keep out information.
This will be our last question.
Thank you, Dr. Russell, for the fantastic presentation. It's very interesting that you said that the best way to try to get this solution is to providing trust, building the trust. But with so many measures that you have tried to count for how many hacks you have, well, you can see the hack or the breach of security coming through the cyberspace by using advanced technology to identify them. And well, we are also trying to do diplomatically to build the trust, right? So how do you measure if that solution is working out, the strategy is working out or not? If you want to see that you see a downturn trend of that hacking, or you just stop tracking it. If you build the trust, why you waste your time and money to track it, right? That's question number one. Question number two is that with advance of technology, you probably, today you are tracking it, you can only identify 100. Tomorrow, with the same technology, with the more advanced technology, you identify 200. Well, that's not because the hacking is increasing, but because you have a better way to identify it. So how do you measure that solution is workable or not? It's my question.
That's a very good question. Thank you. With regards to the first part of the question, why should you keep track of it if you're trying to build and foster trust? It's a great point, but I think at this stage of the game, I would be a proponent of the trust but verify approach, where while we're building trust, part of building trust is finding evidence that all partners are doing what they say that they're doing. So I think in the early years and the stage of the game, it's important to have some sort of evidence that parties are following through on what they say they'll do. So I think the trust but verify is perfectly appropriate, and for the short to medium term, while that trust is really being established. And your second question, you raised a very interesting point. If we have better ways to detect, then how do we know that our measurements are accurate? I don't know. This is a problem that I think we see in a lot of different sectors. We see this in climate change sometimes. People argue with more sensitive instruments now. We see this in the medical field, where we're able to diagnose things that we couldn't diagnose before. I don't know. I don't know exactly what the answer is to how do we deal with that. Maybe we just simply bear in mind that our technology is becoming more sensitive, and we are able to do more with it as a result of that. But we should keep that in mind, that just because numbers increase doesn't mean attacks are increasing. They could be staying constant. So I think it's just being cognizant of that fact, and that improved technology might lead to different results, even if there's not a change of behavior. But it can be misleading, so we should be on guard to make sure we're understanding the data the way that it should be interpreted, because the data is the data, but it's how we interpret it that matters.
And many thanks, Dr. Russell, for such an informative presentation at such a busy time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, and I apologize again.
So actually, before we actually just have everyone try to move down a little. It seems we've lost a lot of people to Easter and Passover, but if we could just try to move down a little.
Our next speaker is Ian Easton from the Project 2049 Institute, which conducts research across a variety of sectors to guide policymakers toward a more secure Asia by the middle of the century. Mr. Easton has studied at Fudan University in Shanghai, and also spent 5 years in Taiwan with a number of different organizations, including the Foundation on Asia-Pacific Peace Studies. He recently worked at the Center for Naval Analyses, translating and analyzing Chinese language materials. We're very excited to hear your presentation.
Well, good afternoon. First, I would just like to thank the students at Tufts and all the organizers, but especially the students. First, thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for the invite to be here today. It is truly a privilege and a pleasure to be at the Fletcher School. Now, I've been asked to say a few things about China's military modernization program. As you all know, China has been investing very heavily in its military, particularly for the past 2 decades or so. We've seen China's military budget increase by over 10% a year for about 17 years now. And this is particularly significant because for the past 3 years, China's military budget has increased faster than China's GDP, which means, since China has not raised taxes, as far as I'm aware, which means that money is coming from other accounts in order to support China's military modernization program, right? And the question that I have is, where's money coming from? If China's spending so much money on its military, say 14% budget growth a year when the economy is only growing by 7-8%, is that money coming from public infrastructure? Is it coming from Social Security or healthcare? Is it coming from science and technology? It's just not clear. But clearly, sacrifices are being made in China in order to support such a rapid pace of military growth. And I think that's significant. And it's especially significant, at least from the U.S. perspective, because China faces no great external challenge from our perspective, right? The U.S. military budget is on the decline. The U.S. military is making some very significant cutbacks, very painful cutbacks for folks in D.C. especially, but also across the U.S. military. Japan has had a stagnant military budget. It's been pretty much a flat line in terms of growth for over 10 years. Now, there's been a slight growth this year, but according to everything that we hear, that's just kind of a one-off type thing. Taiwan's military budget has been modest, and it's been steady. It's not growing. Same with Australia. And so where's the sense of crisis come from? Because as you know, governments don't spend that amount of money and have that level of increase year on year in terms of budgeting if there's no sense of crisis. Well, I would argue that if you look at it from Beijing's perspective, there are many drivers behind a sense of insecurity or sense of crisis, external and internal. External crisis drivers, or the sense of crisis, are many. As we heard yesterday from the panel on the rebalance or the pivot, the Chinese perspective is, despite our best attempts to convince them otherwise, the Chinese perspective is that the pivot or the rebalance to Asia is all about containing China. It's all about containing China. And so I think there's a sense of crisis that's associated with the rebalance, despite our attempts to reassure the Chinese, despite the fact that our military is actually getting smaller. And the same with Japan. Japan is investing. Again, it's not growing significantly, but it does have a sizable military budget. It's investing in some very problematic capabilities from the Chinese perspective. The Japanese Navy is still the best Navy in Asia. It's still better than China's Navy. And so that's problematic. The Japanese are working very hard with us right now to improve the quality of what our two militaries can do together. Taiwan is the same situation. Taiwan in recent years has developed some very problematic military capabilities, asymmetric military capabilities, which are very worrisome from China's perspective. And so for all these reasons and many more, there is a sense of concern, I think, in Beijing in terms of external security. But I would argue that the internal security picture is even more worrisome for China. And I think this is probably what folks in the CCP at the top levels of leadership worry about the most. As you know, China has some of the world's most polluted air and water. It suffers from a demographic crisis, right? There's a tremendous gender imbalance where, because of the one China policy, where we're going to see by 2020, 20 million or more males which can't find spouses and won't be able to settle down and have families and integrate and become part of society. So what does that mean for social stability, which is also a problem that China faces, right? We see something like 300 riots a day in China on average, according to what little data comes out on this. Now, you can euphemistically refer to it as a demonstration or as a sudden mass incident, as the Chinese do. But to me, it looks like a riot. And so there's a tremendous sense of social instability in China as a function of, I think, the pollution, the endemic corruption, the demographic issues, and many other challenges that China faces. We've also seen political instability, which is almost unthinkable, right? Because that was one of the things that we expected from the CCP was, if nothing else, it would be stable. Well, with the Bo Xilai case, and now with the purge of Zhou Yongkang and others in the Ministry of Public Security, there is truly reason to think that there's been some significant public security issues and some political security issues. Bear in mind that before he became General Secretary, Xi Jinping disappeared for a month, right? Before he became General Secretary and Chairman of the CMC, and before he became president, he disappeared for a month. And it's not clear where he was. So there is a sense of political instability in China. Now, I think that's largely abated due to the purges that have taken place. But it's a constant challenge. And so for all these reasons and many others, it makes perfect sense from Beijing's perspective to invest in very large military. And I think it makes sense for at least two reasons. The first of which is that the Chinese military, the PLA, is the ultimate guarantor of the CCP's continued monopolization on political power in China. Bear in mind, of course, that China does not have a normal military. It's not like the U.S. military or the British military or the Japanese military. They don't have a national military. They have what we refer to as a party army, which means that you have political officers at every level, from the very top to the very bottom, and you have every officer, every single officer, career officer in the PLA is a member of the Chinese Communist Party. And all important decisions are made by Communist Party committees within the military. They're not made by the shooters or the operators. Now, the operators have a say, but as far as we can tell, the important decisions are actually made by the party. And so, for that reason, it makes sense to invest in a strong military, right? Because when push comes to shove in China, the top leadership in Beijing can expect that the army is going to be there for their personal security. The second reason it makes good sense is because when China is suffering slow economic growth, by Chinese standards, 7-8% a year is almost catastrophic compared to 10 or more % a year. Especially with such a large population, especially with so many domestic challenges they have to invest in solving. When you're facing slower economic growth and you're facing a troubling ideological picture from the party's perspective, a strong military is important symbolically, because nothing says I'm a legitimate government more than an aircraft carrier, or more than military space program, or all the other things that China's invested in militarily. A strong military is a symbol of a strong nation. It's a symbol of national unity. It's a symbol of patriotism. And so for all these reasons, it makes good sense, I believe, from Beijing's perspective, to do this. Now, from the U.S. perspective, the implications are less than wholly positive, right? Especially because China's invested in some very troubling weapons systems and capabilities. We've heard about cyber weapons. I won't talk to China's counter space or space weapons programs, but missiles, right? We often hear a lot about the Chinese Navy and sometimes about the Chinese Air Force and the Chinese Army, but I would argue that these are not nearly as problematic as China's missile force. China has invested in very large, in fact the world's largest by a long shot, force of conventionally armed theater missiles. These are battlefield missiles, ground-based, ballistic and cruise missiles. Now that may not seem like a big deal until you think of this. In 1987, the United States and the former Soviet Union sat down and in December of that year, I believe it was December, signed the INF Treaty because we believed these weapons capabilities were so strategically destabilizing that they were dangerous to have. And so we gave up. We in fact outlawed these very same types of capabilities, and so did the Russians. And that became the most successful, arguably, the most successful arms control treaty and the most enduring arms control treaty in human history. We further backed it up with the missile technology control regime in that year, which we used to encourage all of our allies, all of our security partners, and pretty much anybody who would listen to also forego developing ballistic and cruise missiles, because we viewed them as offensive. And the reason we did is because we discovered, with our experience in Western Europe during the Cold War, that these type of capabilities are only good when used in first strike capacity. They're only good when they're on the offense. Right? It's a preemptive capability. When you don't use them preemptively, they become what's referred to as wasting assets. They have little to no defensive utility. And so it is worrisome. It's concerning that China has invested and continues to invest in such a large arsenal of missiles. Now, from the U.S. military's perspective, we have the best Navy in the world, we have the best Air Force in the world, we have the best Army and Marine Corps in the world, so we don't worry about China competing with us in these areas. But the missiles are concerning, and the reason they're concerning is because they're aimed at U.S. power projection platforms, namely, primarily, U.S. air bases and aircraft carriers. China is increasingly able to hold at risk all of our power projection capabilities within about 1,000 miles of China's coastline. And that is extending as time goes by. That range is extending. So all of our bases in Japan, for example, our fleet, when they deploy to the Philippine Sea, they become vulnerable, increasingly vulnerable as time goes on. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because the U.S. way of war, and it's not just the way we fight wars, it's also how we deter or prevent wars, how we reassure our allies. It's all based on air power, ultimately. We tend to take control of the sky very quickly in a conflict situation. We get air superiority and we hold on to it. And in fact, we often have outright air dominance. And that's why since 1953, no U.S. serviceman or woman has been killed on the ground by enemy airstrikes. Since 1953. So if you think of all the wars that we've had to fight and all the men and women that have been killed in those wars, it's pretty impressive that we have not lost a single soldier to enemy air power because we had control of the air. Now that's challenged. And so a lot of programs are starting to come underway, I think, in the Pentagon and elsewhere to help us cope with this problem. because there's no silver bullet. It's like the cyber challenge or the space challenge that we face. It does not lend itself to easy solution. If it did, we would just put 10,000 engineers on it, and they would come up with something that would be good. But unfortunately, it's a real challenge. It's the kind of problem that we can only cope with. But I would argue that our coping ability is going to get better over time. There's a lot of things that we're doing now to help protect our ships, aircraft carriers in particular, and to help harden our air bases and make them more resilient if conflict were to occur. And this is especially important because, again, we use these capabilities primarily and principally to reassure our allies in the region and to maintain regional peace and stability and prosperity, which has been protected and really foundational to the prosperity we've seen in the Asia Pacific for 60 plus years now. And so I am cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to cope with this challenge, but it is certainly a challenge. And I think the implication is that China's military modernization program, in this respect, if not others, is strategically destabilizing. And so that's the challenge that we now face. But I will leave it at that and look forward to any questions or comments you might have. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for your very interesting remarks, Mr. Easton. Up next, we'll hear from Joel Luthnow. Dr. Luthnow is an Asia analyst for the China Security Affairs Group at the Center for Naval Analyses. His primary research interests include Chinese foreign and security policy, Chinese domestic politics, and China-U.S. relations. Dr. Luthnow has held fellowships at Brookings and at Princeton's China in the World program. He is the author of Chinese Diplomacy in the United Nations Security Council, as well as a number of academic articles about East Asian security and political issues. And we're very fortunate to have you here today.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here. Good afternoon. So I've been asked to speak today about China's military, and rather than talking in great detail about any specific area, what I wanted to do was to give you more of a general overview of some of the key developments going on within the PLA right now. And I would do so with reference to three broad areas. First, missions of the PLA. Second, capabilities. And third, institutions and organizations. The main theme that I wanted to highlight is that these are exciting times, and not just for the PLA, which it certainly is, but also for PLA watchers who must find new ways to keep up with a subject that is very much in motion. And so allow me to go through each of these areas relatively quickly, and then hopefully we'll have some time in the Q&A to dive deeper into some of them. So new missions, and let me begin with two very basic questions, and Ian has touched on them pretty well already. First, what are the key security challenges that China's government perceives, and what missions does the PRC government assert that its armed forces should be able to carry out in order to address those challenges? To answer these questions, it's useful to consult China's series of defense white papers. And these are documents that are published biannually by China's State Council and represent the official collective opinion of the PRC government. And they provide some information, at least about the message that China wishes to convey to domestic and global audiences about China's security environment and the roles and missions of its armed forces. The most recent defense white paper was released a year ago in April 2013. Its title is The Diversified Employment of China's Armed Forces. And in it is a description of key security challenges that China is facing at the moment. So thinking in geographic terms, these can be divided into sort of three concentric circles or rings. Dangers within China, dangers in China's near abroad, and dangers in the broader world. So first, our internal challenges. The defense white paper speaks of the three forces, namely separatism, terrorism, and extremism, and says that these are currently on the rise. It also calls on the armed forces to crack down on violent and terrorist activities. The terrorist activities attributed to Uyghur separatists that took place on March 1st of this year comes to mind as an example of the severity of the internal challenges that China is facing in this area. So one of the important missions for the armed forces, and especially the People's Armed Police, will be to wrestle with those challenges. Second are regional challenges. The Defense White Paper names a number of these, including Taiwan independence, which is described as a persistent threat, Japan, which is called out as a problem for making trouble over the Diaoyu Islands, and there's also a thinly veiled reference to the United States. The Defense White Paper says that some countries expanding military presence and strengthening alliances in the Asia-Pacific is adding tensions to the region, which is obviously a reference to the US and its rebalance to Asia. To address these regional challenges and others which aren't stated explicitly in the Defense White Paper, such as tensions on the Korean Peninsula and territorial disputes in the South China Sea, China's armed forces are called on to safeguard borders, resist aggression, and protect maritime rights and interests. Third are challenges beyond the Asia-Pacific. According to the Defense White Paper, security risks to China's overseas interests are on the increase. Although the document doesn't state what exactly those interests are, it's easy to imagine them encompassing both economic interests as well as the lives of Chinese citizens living abroad. For instance, a few years ago, China's military found itself in the position of having to evacuate around 35,000 of its own citizens from Libya. To deal with these extra-regional challenges, the Defense White Paper spells out a variety of missions for the armed forces, which truly are diversified in nature. And these include emergency response and rescue, merchant vessel protection at sea, and evacuation of Chinese nationals in times of crisis. So altogether, the fact that China has enunciated dangers and associated missions for its armed forces in these areas raises some key questions. First, will China's armed forces remain primarily focused on challenges inside the country and in its immediate periphery, especially given the continuation and in some cases the worsening of a number of serious internal and regional challenges? Will it be able to take on a stronger expeditionary focus? In other words, gaining the capabilities and experience necessary to operate much farther from China's shores? And what are the key trade-offs that China and its military will face in responding to these diverse challenges? And hopefully the next Defense White Paper, which will likely be released next year, will give us some additional insight into the answers to these questions. So new equipment and capabilities. To enable these missions, China's armed forces are developing an impressive range of new and evolving capabilities, and Ian has already mentioned a couple of them. To get a sense of what some of these are, it's useful to read the Department of Defense's annual reports to China on China's military developments. The latest DoD China report was released in May 2013, and within its 93 pages are a number of important observations about China's military capabilities. Some of the highlights include the following. First, in the nuclear realm, the report mentions that China is moving ahead with the JL-2, which is a submarine-launched ballistic missile. At the time of the report, the missile appeared set to reach initial operational capability. And when deployed, this would give China's Navy its first credible sea-based nuclear deterrent. Second, the report describes a variety of capabilities that could enable an anti-access and area denial mission, or A2AD, which generally refers to the ability to keep an adversary or potential adversary, such as the US, out of the region in the event of a conflict. And one of the most serious A2AD capabilities that China is developing, according to the report, is the anti-ship ballistic missile, which may be able to strike large surface ships, just as Ian was saying, such as aircraft carriers or air bases as well. Third, China is developing the means to counter US aircraft carriers as well, but it's also developing its own, and it's recently commissioned the Liaoning carrier. So the report states that China's Navy is also in the process of developing several additional aircraft carriers and is working to establish access points throughout the regions where those carriers can be refueled and maintained, and which could give China the ability to project naval and air power farther away from its own shores. Fourth, China is moving ahead with the development of a so-called fifth-generation fighter aircraft, though the report mentions that these are unlikely to be fielded before 2018. Key features of the fifth-generation fighters are high maneuverability, low visibility on radar, and advanced sensors and avionics. And along with this are notable developments in China's unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned combat aerial vehicles. Fifth, the report mentions that China is improving its cyber warfare capabilities, which we've discussed. The report also notes that some cyber attacks that took place in 2012 may have been conducted by China's government and military, but doesn't ascribe that in particular. Key goals of cyber warfare, according to the report, range from stealing information about an adversary's military forces to actually crippling an enemy's computer networks in the event of a crisis. The report also covers a number of other areas such as counter space, electronic warfare, and information operations, all of which could play a significant role in future combat. Given these rapid changes, there will be much anticipation about how PLA modernization is portrayed in the next edition of the DoD China report, which should be coming out in the coming months, and that will be one to read with interest. So third, new organizations. China's new equipment will not be of much use without an array of effective supporting systems and organizations behind them. And so this brings me to kind of the third area of exciting changes within the PLA, which is institutional change. Over the years, the PLA has engaged in various rounds of institutional reforms. According to one count in an article that appeared in a key CCP journal, there have been 13 rounds of major institutional reforms since 1949. These have touched on areas such as logistics, training, personnel management, and command and control. Now it appears that changes are once again afoot within the PLA to make some pretty substantial reforms to these and other institutions. So here, a key document worth reading, and it's actually quite brief, is the section on national defense reforms that's contained within the final decision document of the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee, which was a major gathering of the CCP leadership that was held in November. At the third plenum, China's leaders decided that it would be in the nation's interest to undertake significant reforms across several of the armed forces' key institutions. And these reforms are envisioned to include the following: improving joint combat command organizations, optimizing the size and composition of the armed forces, including adjusting the ratios between the different services, for instance, between the ground forces and the Navy, reforming China's military academies and other training and professional military education systems, reforming social welfare systems in the PLA, such as those related to soldiers, insurance, healthcare, and housing, and improving civil-military integration and making changes to the National Defense Research and Development System, and the list goes on and on. To be sure, a few details about the latest round of reforms have been released, and the process may be a slow one, but appears to be making some progress with the recent creation of a leading group for reform under the Central Military Commission. Nevertheless, there are some key issues that we should continue to watch, and these include the following. First, the nature of the Joint Combat Command Organizations referenced in the third plenum decision. Second, the extent to which resources will be reallocated among the services, such as from the ground forces to the maritime and naval forces. And third, the future of the current system of 7 military regions within China that may be adjusted as part of these reforms. So in addition to reforms within the PLA, it's also worth mentioning that the third plenum resulted in another major organizational decision that could affect the military, and that's the creation of a new National Security Commission within China to be chaired by Xi Jinping himself. And the role of the PLA in this new body is unknown, as are the ways in which it will interact with the Central Military Commission. However, this new NSC raises an important analytic issue, which is how China will attempt to integrate military power with other aspects of national power, such as economic, cultural, and diplomatic resources, in order to address some of the security challenges that I mentioned earlier. And whether the NSC will be able to do this is still unclear, but it's certainly a question that we should be asking. So I began by asserting that these are exciting times for the PLA, and I've tried to show how this is the case in 3 main areas: missions, capabilities, and institutions. But I also mentioned that these are exciting times for PLA watchers as well. And I would just amend that by saying that while these are exciting times for those of us who study the PLA, they're also challenging times. So let me conclude by describing what I see as a key challenge in studying China's armed forces and some thoughts about how to address it. So the challenge is identifying and bringing to bear the best possible data on whatever aspect of China's military one is interested in examining. A generation ago, the challenge was getting any quality information about the PLA whatsoever. At that time, it was difficult to visit China, and official publications were hard to come by. Today, we have sort of the opposite problem. We can interact with the PLA so often and have so much data from the PLA, such as newspapers, journals, books, and reports, that it can be hard to make sense of all the information at our disposal. And needless to say, there's also a huge amount of information, speculation, commentary, and even some genuine analysis about the PLA from the US, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and elsewhere around the globe. So I think we need to think carefully about how to separate the signal from the noise, or to put it another way, how to distinguish sources and materials that can really tell us something important and accurate about how China's military views the world, what it's planning to do, or how it's planning to do it from those that do not. Part of that means identifying key sources, namely those that are authoritative, credible, and reliable, and conversely learning to stay away from materials that are non-authoritative, non-credible, and unreliable. Part of it means understanding the purposes of the documents that we're reading. So for instance, each of the 3 key documents that I mentioned today, the Defense White Paper, the DoD China Report, and the third plenum decision document, were all written for a particular audience with a particular goal in mind. So we need to know what those goals are and how the authors may be attempting to shape and influence our views when we read these materials. And it also means finding ways to cross-check information so that we avoid over-relying on any particular source of data, regardless of its provenance. And that's certainly a challenge, but a challenge that I think that we can overcome as analysts and PLA watchers by thinking critically and keeping close to the data that we have at our disposal. So why don't I end there, and I'll look forward to your questions, and we can dig deeper into any of those topics. And thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Dr. Worthman, thank you very much for your interesting perspective on PLA developments. I now have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Greg Austin, who many of us had the pleasure of hearing speak yesterday for the David Rawson Memorial Lecture. Dr. Austin heads the Policy Innovation Unit at the East-West Institute, which seeks to address current and emerging problems that threaten regional and global stability, and which has been referred to as a think and do tank by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Dr. Austin's more than 3-decade-long career in international affairs has included a number of senior positions in academia, government, and policy organizations, including the International Crisis Group and the Foreign Policy Center in London. We are particularly fortunate to have Dr. Austin today, as he has very recently finished his latest book, Cyber Policy in China. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Hiram. Ladies and gentlemen, pleasure to be here. I thought I'd put 2 pieces of analysis together, some on the military issues which have been raised by the previous speakers, but then go across to the economic and technological underpinnings of China's military power, especially with regard to cyberspace. I thought I'd like to put a little bit of historical perspective on what we've heard. Joel mentioned the white papers, and one of the most interesting evolutions in Chinese defense policy in the last 30 years was a decision around about 2002 to see information warfare as the determining factor of victory in modern war. And this was reflected in the the white paper, which I think came out in was it 2003, the white paper, or 2004, the date escapes me exactly. But certainly the military, was a 2004 white paper. The Central Military Commission approved in December 2003 a decision to change China's military doctrine from fighting local wars or winning local wars under high-tech conditions to winning local wars under conditions of informatization. This is a rather complex word that Alison raised before. So informatization means, information age conditions. So what's really interesting about that decision is that it was made at about 15 to 20 years after the United States had made a similar decision. So you can see in 1994, for example, the United States had decisively shifted to information dominance in warfare. So it took the PLA quite a bit of time to catch up. They were studying US combat operations in different wars, like the 1991 war against Iraq and so on. And ultimately, it was the war in Afghanistan, the air war in Afghanistan, which prompted the PLA to make the final decision to shift. when they made the decision to shift to informatization as the main line of policy in warfare, they also tacked on a very classic communist Chinese bureaucratic, what you might call drag. And they say, well, we're going to go for informatization, but we've got to finish mechanization first. So here's the People's Liberation Army, which was in 1978, when it started the modernization, really almost a barefoot army. So I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but the soldiers used to wear tennis shoes. They weren't really engaged in much combat. They had this war against Vietnam in 1979, which dragged on for several years. But they were really a very weak, poor, revolutionary, political type army. So by the time we got to 2003 and this decision on informatization and information warfare, they hadn't completed mechanization. So what this decision, this dual decision on informatization plus mechanization meant was that the people who were advocating for informatization and information warfare could do their thing, but the people who still wanted a traditional army who didn't understand anything about cyber war could do their thing and still build all the tanks and still build all the ships and so on, and still have big infantry divisions, which is how we arrived at the 60-point decision in the Central Committee plenum that Joel referred to. We need another round of military transformation because the big decision that was taken in 2003 was not being implemented because everybody still wanted their big army. And one of the implications of one of the express, or Joel mentioned the decision reflected in the plenum document, that there would be some rationalisation of the size of the three services. And that's been a constant theme in speeches to the Central Military Commission since around about 1998. This idea that if you wanted informatization or informatized combat capability, you've got to really cut the size of your armed forces so that they look much more like the size of the United States Armed Forces. So we've got this rather interesting evolution of China coming late to information warfare and informatization as a challenge around about 2003, and whether it's 10, 20 or 30 years behind the United States, it doesn't really matter. It's a long way behind in an institutional context where the PLA is already only very weakly developed mechanizing, notwithstanding all this nice big spend. So how did the evolution unfold after 2003? Well, it took them 3 years to work out the training regulations for information warfare. So the training regulations for information warfare were not adopted by the Central Military Commission until 2006. So that's a pretty long time, but that reflects really the nature of the problem that they're up against. So we get to a point where about later in the decade, they're starting to adopt computerized methods of simulated warfare for the first time and simulated training, and to the point where I think it was in 2013, maybe 2012, where the PLA conducted its first computerized simulation of simultaneous launch of 100 of these medium-range missiles that were talked about. So we really have a slow and painful evolution of the PLA. So you can put the ships in the field, but how do you connect them? And Joel mentioned that one of the points in the 60-point plan for military reform was a 60-point plan for national reform. One of the points referring to military reform related to command and control. And when I had conversations with leading military and intelligence figures in the United States asking them, how do we assess China's capability in the area of cyber warfare? They said, well, you've got to understand how good are they at joint operations and how good are they at command and control. And every single person I interviewed said the United States is so far ahead of China in command and control and in joint operations in terms of combat experience that it's like comparing, apples and weeds. I don't use that terminology, but that's sort of my sort of sense of comparison. They've really got a long way to go, and we can see this sort of evolving in the military programs. We hear a lot about Chinese cyber espionage, and their capability in this field is clearly an exception to the capability across the board in the military domain. So stealing secrets by cyber methods is a simple operation in terms of it involves people at a desk, maybe some human sources in different capacities, collecting bits of information, but you don't have to coordinate much. You just sort of try and penetrate the other side, and then you steal the information. That's cyber espionage. Cyber warfare, to really do it well, you've got to coordinate very many things. You've got to have real-time intelligence, space surveillance. One of the biggest weaknesses of China in information warfare is it doesn't have the network of 70 military satellites that the United States has that can draw on for real-time targeting and real-time intelligence. So there's some really interesting questions that come up when you think about what's the time frame of evolution and what are all these other sort of things that we need to put around it. And I think that's what it's taken into account. So let me shift here from that sort of broad observation to one that's sort of quite complementary, and that is the question of, well, how has China's ambition to become an advanced nation technologically, especially in information technology, unfolded as well? So, and one of the reasons for doing this is that it's a pretty good rule of thumb for analysts who have trouble understanding what's the technological capability of country X's armed forces, is to make an assessment from information that is more readily available in the public domain. What is the general level of capability in the country, or technological capability in the country? This proved to be a very valuable tool in the case of analysing the Soviet Union, and is equally valuable tool in analysing the military capability of China. And what we find is a similar picture. It was only in 2000 that the Chinese government committed itself fully to the goal of informatization of the national economy and society. In 1993, they adopted the goal of moving to an information economy, which is the idea that you can marshal, as Alison was saying, the economic data, and you can marshal all sorts of advanced technology to improve your economy. What the Chinese government decided to do in the year 2000 was move to become an advanced information society where all walks of life were infused with advanced information technology. Everything from health systems, social security, banking, every sector of the community. And what we find in the pursuit of that set of goals by the Chinese leadership is exactly the same sort of mixed picture that I've sketched out in respect of the slow pace of development of military informatization. So we all know, for example, that in China, the agricultural sector is one of the most important sectors in the economy. China's been moving away from agriculture into industry, of course, and to high-tech production. But agriculture remains a mainstay of the country. In economic terms, it also remains a mainstay of the country in terms of political stability, because that's where a lot of the unrest has been happening, especially on the rural edges around cities. And what do we find? We find that the Chinese government has invested 2 to 3 times more money in informatization of primary schools in the cities than it has in the countryside. The Chinese government is just not investing in education, in computers, for kids in the country. They don't care. So that's an amazing thing. But what we also find is that where the Chinese government has invested in informatization and provision of very good resources of information technology in the countryside, it's for Communist Party cadres whose job is to control unrest in the countryside. It's not to the schools. And there are a number of studies in Chinese where the Chinese authors say we can't find any document in China before 2006 which talks about agricultural informatization. So here is agriculture, a very high priority for the Chinese government, and they haven't been able to move the resources into it. Alison put up the information earlier about the penetration of internet and computers in China, which at a national level. It's very impressive. Today, the penetration rate of the internet in rural areas in China is something like 27%. So the basic people on the farms in China don't have access to the same sort of weather information. Actually, the weather information is one of the things they do have access to, but they don't have access to the same sort of sophisticated data that the farmers in the United States have. So let me just shift here from their slide and shift over a bit to industry policy. And what we see in industry policy, where you'd think that the Chinese government has a lot of the levers under its control, the picture is more or less the same. So in about 2000, the biggest steelworks in the country converted to computerized management for the first time. So they used to have computerized accounting. they move from computerized accounting to computerized management of their systems. So this is really where it all started. In 2000, the Chinese government set up a 100-person or 200-person task force to set up a modern informatized banking system where you could exchange money between banks and operate internationally. So that really only happened in the year 2000. So we've got a very slow evolution. And what we see in industry policy is that the Chinese government has not been able to establish the same relationship between industries and the university research that have proven absolutely essential in the United States case to technical innovation. So that's yet another example of the sorts of huge obstacles that a government has to overcome to move from really what were primitive conditions in 1978 to the ambitions, to achieve the ambitions that they have both in military terms and in national science and technology. Let me stop there. I think that's enough. Thanks.
Many thanks for your presentation. If we have just a few minutes, I'd love to offer our three panelists the opportunity to respond to each other's presentations if they have any specific comments. Feel free to jump in, and then I'll open up the floor for a Q&A. We'll open up the floor for Q&A. Please briefly introduce yourself and state your affiliation. And then if you have a question for a specific panelist, please.
So I'm Ben Spivak from the Tufts undergraduate and junior. So questions for Joel, but if anybody, the other panelists want to jump in, feel free. You were talking about regional security challenges, and you talked about the Taiwan and the East Chinese Sea. I noticed you didn't mention Central Asia, the drawdown in Afghanistan. And I was wondering, given China's policy of non-aggression, they've sort of been very hesitant and haven't really gotten involved with a on-the-ground military presence in Central Asia beyond the sort of counterterrorism cooperation drills. So I was wondering if you knew of any military development that was specifically, or intelligence gathering or anything like that, specifically towards Central Asia and the security in the region.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. Central Asia is part of China's periphery, and I think a broad point that I would want to make is that when we think about China, look at the map. The United States has a very favorable position in the sense that we have two countries that border us, one of which is a close friend, another of which is also a close friend, and we have very few challenges, relatively speaking, from either of them. China is bordered by more than a dozen countries, many of which are in some particular state of crisis or turmoil. And so when we interpret China and what it's doing in the region, we have to think, how does it see its position with respect to some of these challenges? Central Asia certainly comes up as an area where China is facing turmoil on one of its borders. The drawdown in Afghanistan is, I think, actually seen as a problem. Based on my own conversations with Chinese interlocutors, they do not, it's like this, they don't want the US military to be there, but they also don't want the US military to leave, because that creates a bit of a vacuum in which more problems, drug trafficking and terrorism, things like this, can fester. And so those problems are referenced indirectly in the defense white paper, but not specifically. There's also kind of a thread in China's strategic thinking about, well, the US is posing more problems on China's eastern periphery, and so China should redouble its effort to gain influence along its western periphery. So in other words, to kind of pick up and fill some of that vacuum when the US leaves. I don't know of anyone arguing that China should send military troops to Afghanistan or Pakistan. That's not really sort of on the table as far as I can tell. But in terms of the idea of gaining political influence, diplomatic influence, things like this, that's being talked about. But my impression is that China is still more concerned about challenges from its eastern periphery, Taiwan, East China Sea, Yellow Sea, South China Sea, simply because more of its economy is kind of located there as well as population. And so Central Asia is, I think, perceived as a challenge, not something that China would address with the military force, unless it's part of a UN peacekeeping operation or this sort of thing. But it's something that they are aware about. And I think the last thing I would mention is that I talked about military developments, but in October there was a high-level meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee, the Central Committee actually, which was talking about sort of a new peripheral diplomacy for China. I think what that means is the use of cultural and diplomatic and economic sort of power to try to stabilize some of these regions, including Central Asia, but really the entire peripheral area. So,
thank you very much.
Hey, my name is Ru Zhang. I am the president of New England Chinese Information and Networking Association. I'm not a tough student, but it's a privilege to be here to hear all those research results. The question I have is actually because we are in the information association, so we kind of very interested in knowing more about how the view of informationalization of this military, also cyber space occupations as well as influence. One thing that I would like to learn more about is when we, it's from Dr. Austin regarding to you see the trend of changing both from the Chinese policy perspective in terms of institutionalize and encourage the use of information in the industry as well as in the PL8 modernization process. Don't you think that's actually equivalent or actually more similar to what US is deploying their technology? What I usually find out is that if NASA have a great technology out there, it's the people in the ordinary life of commercialization work is actually slower to adopt or knowing all those technology, but the military is knowing that first. Well, would that be making sense for a country to make the technology investment more in the military first? If that also equal to Ian's comment on the expansion faster in the military budget than the commercialized or GDP growth rate. Would that be a normal trend, or it's becoming a concern just because China is using it rather than some other country? That's the first question. Second question is that the fluctuation of foreign exchange rate that being taken into consideration of those research? Because well, when you have to build a technology in China, it's not innovative independently enough in their country for those technology. They have to buy equipment from overseas. And the Chinese yen, RMB was for, with other foreign exchange rate fluctuation would attribute to that. I don't know how that number comes out with in terms of budgeting. So those two questions.
Thanks for very complex questions. The first one I'd address by referring to the role of the private sector in US military research and development.
Right.
So even though it's funded by the Defense Department, it's actually mostly the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
There are some exceptions to that. And one of the big hopes for China, in a sense, is when the private sector becomes more prominent and more powerful. It was only in 2005 or 2006 that the Chinese government recognized that the private sector had the primary lead in the development of information technology, and that the government should step back considerably. What they haven't been able to develop at the same time as the class of innovators that goes with that in the right numbers. So I think the US model is the right model for China, but the US model is not that it was developed inside some sort of, in a sense, isolated military research. It was a military research activity that was completely and totally, well, not totally, but very largely underpinned by private sector participation in that, where the private sector were responsible for taking out some of the technologies from the military side into the other side. So as the private sector opens up in China, that's estimated by 2020 to be about 75% of the economy. So that's one thing. Ian, do you want to talk about the exchange rate thing? Well, I can. Please do. Okay. The overwhelming share of software and technology in China is not Chinese. So it has to be paid for in hard currency. China's a very wealthy country, the exchange rate is artificial, and that benefits China, not the rest of the world. So on the one hand, there's a burden for buying all of that foreign technology. The military technology may be an exception, but arguably not. I mean, in my book, for example, I demonstrate that almost the entire software capability for the Ministry of Public Security for internal surveillance and control came from the United States. So that's changing over time. So the exchange rate, in one sense, China's had to buy a lot overseas. It's a very wealthy country, but it's also benefited from an artificially managed exchange rate.
Great, thanks. Do I have time for one more question? For the mobile technology that's being popular, very popularly used in the Chinese territory today, you can see that the countryside is using more and more than the cities because of the way of the infrastructure is being built. Information being shared over there, would that become one of the reasons that they have to increase the PLA, strengthen the PLA in order to be able to harden the potential concerns internally?
Well, that is a concern, and the ability of people to communicate quickly to organise demonstrations is one of the highest concerns. Mobile telephony is less penetrable than internet telephony, so it's a particular problem in the countryside of monitoring that. So it does create an extra problem.
Thank you.
Stan Rosen, University of Southern California. A question for Greg, very interesting presentation. In terms of issues like innovation or command and control, universities collaborating with industry, private enterprise in China compared to the American model of private enterprise, I'm wondering, some people like John Mearsheimer, offensive realists, making predictions about by the year 2020, 2025, Taiwan will automatically go back to China, nobody can stand up to China, suggesting a trend line where these things will be solved. Based on your comments, I'm wondering how you see the trend line, but also what are the problems China faces in things like innovation, command and control, coordination, cultural issues, structural issues. How do they solve that? Because it seems to me, even if private enterprise is 75% of the economy by a certain date, they're still not going to give this kind of information, secret information, to private enterprises, especially with so many entrepreneurs leaving for the United States and other countries. There's going to be that kind of control over secrecy, which is cultural as well as structural, given the nature of the political system. So I'm wondering how you see these trends developing.
Thanks, Sam. It's a very good question, and the control of information is the biggest single restraint on China's innovation development, and they don't realise that, or they don't talk about it, or they don't want to talk about it. But in everything I've read, they don't address that. University researchers are not allowed to get access to maps in China and GIS information. They're classified as state secrets, and that's only a relatively recent decision. Environmental researchers can't get access to soil pollution survey data because that's a state secret. So this country can't go anywhere sensibly and comprehensively. It can develop all sorts of niche products. So Huawei can become one of the biggest telecommunications switch companies in the world. China can produce more PCs than any other country in the world. Well, they're great niche achievements, but to open up this whole expanse of the potential of economic development and technology, they're not going to go anywhere until they solve that. The universities is another pretty big problem. I'll stop there.
If I could, I'd like to comment on that as well. I thought that was an excellent question. You raised the idea of, Mearsheimer's argument regarding Taiwan. And I think it's an interesting argument, but I think you touched upon the very thing that would undermine his argument. And that is the fact that technological innovation and change over time, increasingly, I would argue, is actually favoring the defender over the offensive side, which is to say that it's increasingly difficult, as we're finding out, to project power. And China's learning this. I think, as well, because now it has to face a Japan and a Taiwan, which are developing some of the world's most sophisticated anti-ship cruise missiles, shore defense systems, guided rockets, all the capabilities that you would need to make sure that while the other guy may be able to bomb you from afar, he could never put his Marines or his naval infantry, as China refers to them, on your beaches. And so that's, I think, one of the big challenges that China is going to have going forward is in terms of being able to coerce its neighbors. Maybe it'll have that ability to hit them from afar with counter-space weapons or cyber weapons or missiles. But in terms of actually being able to invade anybody and put boots on the ground on islands in the East China Sea or the South China Sea or in Taiwan, I think it's going to get increasingly difficult for China going forward. And so I think the implications of that are that China is going to have to rely on even more of the coercive element because it just won't be able to project power in the same way that it's becoming more difficult for the United States and other countries to project power.
Well, big thank you to everyone in the audience for the difficult and pressing questions for our panelists. And a huge thank you to our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us during what is, for many of us, a very busy weekend. Up next, we'll do a short break, and then we'll be having multiple breakout sessions as outlined in the brochure. But first, please join me in a warm round of applause for our panelists.
Just a quick announcement before everybody gets up. There's been a slight change to the breakout sessions. For the interest of time and space, we're going to combine them into one breakout session. We're going to have 3 presentations and then this discussion time. So the good news is you don't have to choose it. 205, Cabot 205, which is just outside downstairs.